The word boredom didn't exist until the 1760s. Before that, humans had spent thousands of years feeling something we had no name for. Though they certainly experienced restlessness and dissatisfaction, these feelings lived in completely different mental worlds. What changed wasn't our capacity for tedium, but something far more profound: the entire structure of human time itself. Hi guys, I'm Monty and I'm a linguist and a history enthusiast. I create videos that give you a new perspective on modern concepts. If you learned something from this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to my channel to help me grow and create more of this kind of content. And let me know in the comments what you'd like to see me talk about in my next video. You've probably never questioned why boredom feels so distinctly modern, so tied to waiting rooms and traffic jams and endless Zoom meetings. But that instinct? It's spot on. The boredom you experience while mindlessly scrolling your phone at 2 AM isn't the same phenomenon that a medieval peasant might have felt during a long winter. Sure, both might involve restlessness or dissatisfaction, but these are different experiences, shaped by different understandings of time and meaning. The emergence of boredom as a named, recognized emotional state develops alongside the Industrial Revolution. These changes aren't perfectly synchronized, but they're deeply connected. The very concept of modern boredom required a complete transformation in how humans understood work, time, and meaning itself. Before factories, before clocks, before the rigid separation of labor and leisure, the psychological experience we call boredom simply couldn't exist in its modern form. Today, we're going to trace this transformation, from the desert monks who first grappled with something like boredom, through the aristocrats who turned it into an art form, to the factory workers who made it a mass phenomenon. Because understanding boredom means understanding how we became modern. Let's start with what came before. In the 4th century, Christian monks retreating to the Egyptian desert encountered something they called acedia, from the Greek word meaning without care. But acedia wasn't boredom as we know it. It was spiritual listlessness, a dangerous falling away from devotion to God that struck around midday when the desert sun was highest and prayer felt most difficult. John Cassian, writing around 420, described acedia as striking monks with restlessness that made them abandon their cells, neglect their prayers, and yearn for any activity other than contemplation. Later medieval writers would call this the noonday demon. Acedia differed from modern boredom in one key way. This wasn't about having nothing to do. It was about losing the will to do what you were supposed to do. Acedia was a sin, a moral failing that required confession and penance. This spiritual framework dominated European thinking about restlessness and dissatisfaction for over 1,000 years. When medieval scholars encountered similar feelings, they categorized them as forms of melancholia, one of the 4 humours that governed human temperament. Melancholia could strike anyone, but it was understood as a medical condition, not a response to circumstances. The medieval world simply didn't have the conceptual framework for modern boredom because it lacked the prerequisites. Time wasn't standardized. You worked when there was light, when crops needed tending, when seasons demanded it. Work wasn't separated from life. A blacksmith was a blacksmith, whether he was shoeing horses or teaching his son the trade or gossiping with neighbours while he worked. Most importantly, individual fulfillment wasn't the point of existence. You had a role, determined by birth and blessed by God, and meaning came from fulfilling that role properly. But cracks were already showing by the Renaissance. In 1621, Robert Burton published The Anatomy of Melancholy, a massive treatise that included what might be the first systematic analysis of something resembling modern boredom. Burton wrote about that other extreme of idleness, where people know not how to spend their time and fall into a kind of supine carelessness. Crucially, Burton connected this condition not to spiritual failing, but to social circumstances, particularly among the wealthy who had nothing to do. Burton had broken with 1,000 years of tradition. Where medieval thinkers saw moral failure, he saw structural problems. He was suggesting that having nothing meaningful to occupy yourself could create psychological distress, regardless of your moral character. He was describing a problem of circumstance, not soul. The word bore itself emerged in the early 18th century, initially describing a person who is tediously dull in conversation or manner. Samuel Johnson's 1755 dictionary defined to bore as to make a hole by turning. The connection to tedious people came from the metaphor of drilling holes in someone's patience. But notice, the problem was still located in other people, not in circumstances or internal states. Industrialization transformed boredom, but through an unexpected mechanism. The standard story goes that factories created repetitive work, which created boredom, but that misses the deeper transformation. Pre-industrial work was often incredibly repetitive. A farmer planting corn followed the same spring ritual for generations. A weaver spent entire days threading the same patterns. The difference wasn't repetition, the difference was meaning. Before industrialization, work was embedded in a web of relationships and purposes that made tedium bearable. A farmer planting the same field his grandfather had planted was participating in a cycle of seasons, family, and community that gave even monotonous tasks significance. The work had intrinsic value because it directly sustained life. Factory work shattered this connection. Suddenly, millions of people were performing tasks that had no intrinsic meaning, turning screws, pulling levers, monitoring machines in service of products they would never see completed, for wages that barely sustained them in buildings that could have been anywhere. For the first time in human history, work became purely instrumental, a means to earn money to live, nothing more. This created a new psychological challenge that historians now recognize as a defining feature of 19th century industrial life. The word boredom itself appears in English texts by the 1760s, but it gained widespread currency through writers like Charles Dickens. In Bleak House, published in 1853, Dickens used it to describe the existential emptiness of Lady Dedlock, an aristocrat who had been bored to death by everything life offered. But Dickens wasn't just documenting upper-class ennui. He was identifying a new form of human suffering that was spreading throughout society. The timing is crucial. The 1850s were the peak of the first industrial revolution. Millions of people were streaming from rural areas into cities, from agricultural work into factories, from lives governed by natural rhythms into lives governed by clock time. And they were discovering that this new form of existence created a psychological state that had never existed before on such a scale. But the story gets complicated here. Boredom didn't just emerge from industrial work, it emerged from industrial leisure. The same forces that created factory schedules also created the weekend, the 8-hour day, the concept of free time as a distinct category of experience. For the first time in history, large numbers of people had blocks of time that were explicitly not for work, not for survival, not for religious obligation, time that was supposed to be for themselves. This created a new psychological challenge. Humans had never had to figure out what to do with purposeless time. Pre-industrial people had rest, they had festivals, they had seasons of lighter work, but these were always embedded in larger cycles of meaning. Industrial leisure was different, empty time that you were supposed to fill with what exactly? The answer, increasingly, was consumption. The late 19th century saw the birth of the entertainment industry, mass-produced novels, organized sports, department stores designed for browsing rather than buying specific items. Entire industries emerged to solve the problem of boredom, which meant, for the first time, that boredom became profitable. This created a feedback loop that persists today. Boredom drives consumption, but consumption that fails to provide lasting meaning creates more boredom, which drives more consumption. The cycle was already visible by the 1890s, when social critics began warning about the disease of leisure affecting both factory workers and the wealthy. By the early 20th century, boredom had become a central concern of industrial psychology. Researchers like Hugo Munsterberg and Lillian Gilbreth studied industrial fatigue and monotony effects, not out of humanitarian concern, but because bored workers were less productive and more likely to organize unions. Boredom, it turned out, was politically dangerous. companies started trying to reduce boredom through job design, workplace music, and what we now call gamification. The goal wasn't to make work meaningful. That would have required reshaping industrial capitalism itself. The goal was to make meaningless work tolerable. But the most profound change was philosophical. Boredom forced a complete reconceptualization of human nature and the good life. For thousands of years, Western thought had assumed that meaning came from external sources: God, community, tradition, natural law. Boredom revealed that meaning might be something individuals had to create for themselves. This insight spawned existentialism, the philosophical movement that made boredom central to the human condition. Soren Kierkegaard argued that boredom was the root of all evil, but also the starting point for authentic existence. Martin Heidegger claimed that profound boredom revealed the groundlessness of existence, forcing individuals to confront their freedom to create meaning. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that humans were condemned to be free, and boredom was the experience of that condemnation. These weren't abstract philosophical points. They were attempts to make sense of a genuinely new form of human experience that industrial modernity had created. The existentialists understood that boredom wasn't just an emotion, it was a signal that the old sources of meaning had broken down and new ones hadn't yet emerged. This explains why boredom feels so different from other negative emotions. Fear, anger, sadness, these point towards specific problems with specific solutions. Boredom is more elemental. It's the experience of meaninglessness itself, the recognition that the activities filling your time don't connect to anything larger than themselves. The digital age has intensified this dynamic exponentially. We now have unprecedented access to stimulation, infinite content, instant communication, endless entertainment options. But stimulation isn't meaning. If anything, the constant availability of distraction has made the underlying meaninglessness more acute. We can avoid boredom more easily than ever before, but we can't avoid the conditions that create it. This is why boredom feels so urgent in the smartphone era. It's not that we're more bored than previous generations, it's that we have fewer excuses for not addressing the deeper problems that boredom reveals. When distraction is always available, choosing to sit with boredom becomes a conscious act of confronting the question of what, if anything, makes life worth living. The next time you feel bored, remember, you're experiencing something that didn't exist for most of human history. That restless, empty feeling isn't a personal failing or a temporary inconvenience. It's the emotional signature of modernity itself. The price we pay for lives organized around individual choice rather than inherited meaning. Your great-great-grandmother, working dawn to dusk on a farm, might have felt tired, frustrated, or overwhelmed, but she probably never felt bored. Whether that makes us lucky or cursed, that's a question each of us has to answer for ourselves.